everybody. My name is Rick Gowdzwaard, and I'm host of the show ArtistsEdge, where we seek to bring encouragement, inspiration, and ideas to not only up-and-coming, but established artists as well, taking your artistry to the next level. So with no further ado, here's our guest today. So I'd like to welcome Brenda Wilbee to our show today. Hi, Brenda.
Hi, Rick. It's nice to see you.
Yeah. Brenda is an award-winning author of 11 books with over 700,000 copies sold. Her latest release is Taming the Dragons, Powerful Choices for Women in Conflict and Pain. First off, how did you get into writing?
Well, it's something I've always done, but what really focused me is when my family immigrated to the United States when I was in grade 6 from Canada. We landed in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is 30 miles outside of Detroit, right in the middle of the race riots and civil rights movement. And I could not understand the vociferous hatred of African Americans. And what's his name? C.D. Lewis once wrote, "We don't write in order to be understood, but we write in order to understand." And so my junior high years, I had plenty to cut my teeth on because I just couldn't understand this. I was fortunate in that ninth grade civics teacher, Mr. Stewart, taught us how to really critically think. And so he had us reading all kinds of books like Black Like Me and Animal Farm and everything to do with injustice. And we had to write then our response to the book. He would play devil's advocate and throw the paper back at us, and we had to then support our concepts, document them, throw it back at him. This could go back and forth many times until he was satisfied we had really made a cogent thought, not just an opinion, but our opinions based on research and data. And then when we moved to Iowa, I was fortunate, very fortunate again, to have an English teacher who taught me the infrastructure of writing. And I decided I was just going to follow her rules right and left. And she started selling those homework assignments to local newspapers. And so I was a writer without decision. She just sort of did that for me. I started publishing in junior high, and all that early writing dealt with issues of injustice on many levels. So that's how I got started writing.
Sure. Wow. Quite a journey. And at such a young age. So you've written now 10 books, now actually 11, all nonfiction or fiction? What?
Well, I normally write biographical novels, of women in the 1800s, women who have something to say to women of today. My kids used to joke, "Mom, if you wrote something people really wanted to read, we'd eat better." So I recognize that biographical novels are not up there with all the thrillers and sci-fi of today.
Sure.
But that I'm best known for a series I did on Louisa Bourne Denny, who laid the first foundation in the city of Seattle. And those 6 books cover Seattle's first 5 years of existence. So that's what I'm basically known for and what I enjoy writing. But in 1982, I went through a divorce, literally my head in shambles. We knew each other then, so you know how scrambled I really was. I went back to school to try and understand what happened to an otherwise smart brain. I was an intelligent human being. So I had to go back to school and understand, how did this all get dismantled? Where I just was so powerless and vulnerable and had no choices in life. So I went back to school. I studied psychologies of all kinds, deviant psychology, women's psychology, family of origin theory. And in that search, then I started to put my life back together. I started to rebuild my mind, more or less. And in that process, discovered that I was hardly the only person who this had happened to.
Yeah.
And so I recognized the vulnerability of women, the injustice against women, and started to write then Taming the Dragons as my own journey out of that and capsulizing everything I had come to understand. And again, writing in order to understand, not to be understood. So in writing that book, Taming the Dragons in 1992, 10 years after my divorce and my schooling, I actually then was able to shape it into something other people could understand.
Sure, sure.
Because my concern has always been specifically for the evangelical woman who is really caught in a mindset of subservience, to literally think for herself or to question anything was consigning herself to hell. This was just not an option for her. Yeah. So I wrote Taming the Dragons. The original edition came out with HarperCollins in San Francisco, and they chose the subtitle of Christian Women Resolving Conflict. So that was like in 1992, 40 years ago. My second nonfiction is just something I did in 2013 for the 1 million visitors that come through Skagway, Alaska. Yeah. On the cruise ships, we are the last point of stop. And because I'm a historian, it's the gold rush, 1898. I did a small book for tourism where I included sketches of now and then and a brief history of everything they could expect to discover about our little town up there.
I see.
Well, yeah. Those were the two nonfictions in addition to the other biographical novels. I think I wandered off the question, did I?
Oh, not at all. Not at all. So in your latest book, Taming the Dragons, Powerful Choices for Women in Conflict and Pain. So obviously women are your audience. And you talked a little bit about women in conflict and pain. And even though it's geared at, let's say, an evangelical Christian woman, it sounds like it's a book that's really aimed at all women.
It's aimed at all women because the dynamics of abuse or powerlessness, even just frustration, stagnation, needing a transition in your life, it's all the same. Those dynamics don't change. The language changes. Yeah. So Taming the Dragons is written in a language that doesn't threaten evangelical women by using story, because only in story can we find safety for our psyche. Story will tell us the truth. So I use the stories of biblical women to demonstrate 6 different choices they have to overcome their powerlessness. But I also, to reach other women who are not evangelical, but who also suffer. I mean, the statistics are 1 out of every 2 men hit their wives.
Wow.
So this is a huge, huge audience of women. I knew a woman once who was so battered at work. It comes from every direction, just on the basis of gender.
Sure.
Because we're smaller, have been disregarded throughout history, literally throughout history, made invisible at not too long ago in our past. We were chattel. So women have this inheritance. So outside of evangelical Christianity, where it's really boxed in, other women who are powerless, I chose then to pair these biblical women with characters from probably argumentatively the most favorite fairy tale of our era, and that's The Wizard of Oz. Uh-huh. So for example, I will couple Eve with Dorothy. Both of them are innocent, one living in paradise, one living in Kansas with, Auntie Anne. So the book is structured with story that can reach women of all faiths without faith.
Sure.
Because those dynamics of emotional wear and tear, we'll say, do not change. It's always the same.
Right. Now, in your book, you talk about 6 choices that women have, the women in pain and those that are experiencing really trauma in their lives. And can you name them and briefly explain how they work?
Yeah, see, this is where the original book, Taming the Dragons, Christian Women Resolving Conflict, 40 years ago, has been reprinted and expanded with the subtitle of Powerful Choices for Women in Conflict and Pain, because that title more perfectly reflects my audience and why I'm writing the book. And I have named 6 choices. There are archetypal choices and role models that we can use. And literally by choosing one of these 6 choices, we're not stuck responding in the same old way. We can look back, sit back and look at conflict and say to ourselves, okay, which is the best way to move in this situation? And even if the choice is the lesser of 2 evils, take that tiny little step, make that one little choice, and magically, literally magically, as in our fairy tales, more choices begin to open up. And the more choices we have, the more we make, and then pretty soon we have a plethora of good choices that we can make. But starting back when we feel powerlessness, I named 6 choices. So these very quickly are orphan, pilgrim, martyr, warrior, wizard. Oh, and I forgot innocent, because we do that a lot too. So let me start briefly talking about the innocent role. This is really fine and good when we're children, you know, and too many children don't get that stage of innocence and suffer for it because they've been pulled out of Eden too soon. And it's also helpful for us as adults because when, say, your husband dies, you fall back into innocence and he didn't really die. He's going to come through the door any minute. You see him on the sidewalk. So it's nature's way of blunting the any kind of trauma in our minds until we can deal with it piece by piece and eventually get to an acceptance.
Yeah.
So there is a reason for being innocent, but it's unhealthy to stay there. We can accept it and accept that we are in kind of a state of denial, but at some point we really have to acknowledge that crisis has happened and we need to start dealing with it, which leads us then to the next role, which is orphan. Orphan is Dorothy, not in Kansas, but guess where? You know, Munchkin Land. With, you know, a house on top of, what's that? Witch's feet? Crisis has a way of just catapulting us like a tornado into a world that's unknown to us. And there's nothing we can do but just say, somebody please save me.
Yeah.
Please will you help me? And that's what the orphan does. She learns really to ask for help. Just ask for help. And in that process, she begins to learn self-reliance, as did Dorothy in Oz. She asked the good witch Glinda, can you help me? And so good witch Glinda gave her the ruby shoes. And with the ruby shoes, an answer to the question, she was able to proceed forward.
And it sounds like in that, there's also an element of courage needed to ask the question or to ask for help.
To ask for help takes a tremendous amount of courage.
Yeah.
It can't be overlooked. I'm glad you brought up that point, because for somebody coming out of a bad situation, whether it's divorce, whether it's death, whether it's getting fired from your job, it takes courage to move from that point of pain to a different space.
Yeah.
So so we've got innocent and orphan. The next choice that's available, and these aren't in any particular linear pattern, I just line them up with the story of the Wizard of Oz. The next choice is pilgrim, learning to think for yourself. So here's Dorothy. She's just going down the yellow brick road. She's off to the Emerald City, and she doesn't know which way to go. She's an orphan, remember? She doesn't know which way to go.
Yeah.
So she's just kind of looking around, and the Scarecrow says, well, you know, that way is a pretty good way, and that way you can go that way. And she sees the Scarecrow, who admits he's uncomfortable with his pole up his back. He's got crows all over himself. He's not able to function as a Scarecrow. Yeah. Something's wrong. He needs to think for himself, and he recognizes this. I don't have a brain. If you could just help me. And see, this is where the orphan starts to gain her courage, because she discovers in her self-reliance that she can actually help somebody else. It's very empowering. So she helps the Scarecrow get down. And we notice in the movie, she doesn't go that way or that way, which is what the Scarecrow suggested. She just goes straight ahead because she's now an orphan who has learned self-reliance, ability to help, and she's thinking for herself. So that's the choice. The role of pilgrim is basically flight from circumstances that no longer work for you to seek clarity and new direction. In the fairy tale, they, of course, stumble across the Tin Man, which works very nicely as a metaphor for the role of martyr, which women, this is drummed into them from the day one. Literally, we sit in our grade 1 classrooms knowing that it's the boys in the classroom who are getting the attention. And we martyr our own self-expression. Well, the chaos is directed by the boys around us is being addressed by the teacher. Just watch a grade 1 class and you can see it for yourself.
Yeah.
So this is drummed into us, particularly for the evangelical women. That is our role. That is our only role in life, to be subservient, to do what we're told, to never think for ourselves. We have to martyr ourselves. This is a complete misunderstanding of martyrdom. And we only need to go to Jesus to understand how wrong this is. He never martyred himself from a position of powerlessness to seat somebody else's selfish agenda. He always martyred himself from a position of power. He laid down his life. No man took it from him. Once he fed 5,000 people, they wanted something more from him, and he left. He didn't always cater to the demands around him. So we can learn better, and we also learn through the Tin Man that martyrdom, having a heart, is not about being all rusty in a tin can and just letting people, So it's a difficult role for any woman to overthrow, basically, to begin to understand that of her sense, when she moves into power and can affect change for those that are vulnerable around her. That is true martyrdom, and it's extremely empowering for themselves and for the people they know and love.
Yes.
But let's get back to courage. Here we run into the lion. He is the cowardly lion. And this role of being a warrior is the hardest for a woman to absorb. We are taught never to fight, and yet we have to fight sometimes. We're called to fight. We're called to fight for our children in domestic courts. We're called to fight for Black Lives Matter. There's so many areas we are called to fight. And so a woman can choose and needs to choose that at times she's got to stand there firm and become a lion, no longer afraid. I could give you so many stories of women warriors, and the book is full of women who have made this choice to our betterment. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, this whole suffrage movement. Nothing happens in our world without somebody fighting for it. The final role, the wizard. So we've got the innocent, the orphan, the pilgrim, the martyr, the warrior, and now we have that last role, the wizard. This is probably the most difficult, because it relies completely on simply stating the truth. To just state the truth and trust that truth will stand and win the day, it almost feels like you're accepting what's not right. Mm-hmm. And it feels almost passive. There's a couple of elements that go with this. Just simply stating the truth, trusting that truth will win in the end. Jesus said, you shall know the truth and the truth will set you free. But many times we can spin a creative alternative. And as women, we're good at that. We can go around we're a river going around the rock. Yeah. And eventually that rock gets, worn down. So we can spin a creative alternative and just watch magic happen. So those are the 5 roles that I use: biblical women and characters from The Wizard of Oz, and a plethora of other stories to walk women through that process.
Yes. Wow. Powerful. Now, so in your book, Taming the Dragons, on page 1, paragraph 1, you write, "Once upon a time, the raging dragon, a hero and damsel in distress. Remember the old fairy tales? Prince Charming and Sleeping Beauty and Happily Ever After? It was always that way in our bedtime stories. But what about real life? What happens in our happily ever after? Daily we lie under the dragon's fire. We can hardly conceive of victory. And so your whole book relies on extensive use of fairy tales, as you've mentioned earlier, and other literature in addition to biblical stories and The Wizard of Oz. Why so much story? Why so much story in essentially a nonfiction book?
Well, probably because I'm basically a novelist.
Yeah.
I love stories. But the bottom line is that really only through story do we understand ourselves. Story has been used since cavemen days, where they sat around the fire and told stories about their existence. The ballads of the medieval era are movies of today. They're stories that reflect who we are and what we're going through as a culture. So story is truth, and truth can best be explained through truth. Kind of a wizardry role, actually. For instance, the value of story, there are over 700 Cinderella stories, virtually in every culture. The story of the flood, every culture has a flood story. So we look at the different details of the story, whether it's from the Old Testament, whether it's from Gilgamesh and Babylon, whatever story, or the native Indians of Pacific Northwest with Mount Sumas, which was their Ararat. There are two canoes lashed together and 2x2 animals boarded on, landing at Sumas. It doesn't matter the details. The truth is there was a flood, because all cultures talk about it. We don't need to understand. We just know there was a flood. And that's the power of story.
Yeah.
And so that's what I use, because it's in story women find safety. They're not having some preacher preach at them. They're not having me, dribble narrative into their ears. It's a story, and that works its magic in somebody's soul and changes them one way or the other.
Yeah.
So that's why the use of story and fairy tale.
Sure. So do you offer a happily ever after in your sense of story and fairy tale?
I do. Because if you look at fairy tales, there is no fairy tale that doesn't have dragons. When we talk about happily ever after, those dragons haven't gone away in those stories. They're there. It's the taming of the dragons that brings happily ever after. It's when we learn to make these choices. It's when we learn to find ways to live and coexist within a conflicted world.
Sure.
And it's basically an acceptance that this is the life that all humans walk. And so by accepting that and then taming the dragons, whatever they are, no matter if they're little or big or overwhelming, it's taming them that brings about happily ever after. We can live in contentment, no matter the fire and wind around us.
Sure.
And of course, throughout history, we see this. Look at Mandela of South Africa. He learned to live and tame those dragons. And he went from 22 years in prison and tortured to president of South Africa. Yeah. So yes, I do offer happily ever after, because that's the magic of life. Yeah.
And all of what you're saying too really is powerful for men as well.
It's what I'm saying. It is the dynamics don't change.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter gender or anything. I just happen to be a woman.
Yeah.
And so I work better with women than men.
Sure.
There are male authors that address these kinds of things all the time. Robert Bly is one of them. Off the top of my head. So you're right. Thanks for pointing that out. It's not just a female thing.
Right.
It's a male thing as well. It's human condition.
Yeah. So what are you working on now? What do you do in your spare time, if you have any, which is questionable, but maybe you do. I don't know.
I don't have any spare time because I've got my finger in a lot of pies. I'm working on another biographical novel of Narcissa Whitman, who was one of first of two women to cross the continent, which she did in 1836. And so I follow her story. I can't even imagine. There was no Oregon Trail. There was nothing.
Wow.
And she came across from New York to Washington. You know, very few women even today do that. So I just find her a fascinating character, and I'm working on her primarily because I want to understand her. I want to hear what she has to say.
Sure.
But in my spare time, and as Alice Walker likes to point out in her essay on writing The Color Purple, that authors really have to sell apples on the street corner in order to make a living. I don't make a whole lot of money on biographical novels, you know, as my kids pointed out years ago. You know, so I've had to do other things. And right now I have developed a business where I edit, and I help women find their voices and get them self-published if they would like to. I walk them through the editorial process. I typeset their books. I'm a graphic designer, so I design covers. I do all of those things, anything a woman needs in order to find and clarify her voice and present it so that it becomes readable for other people. So that's kind of my life.
Wow. So how do we, just as we're closing up now, it's been an amazing discussion. So how do women or men in this case too find your latest books? Where would we be directed to?
Well, you just type in Amazon.com and my name. They're a little bit, they've got the Kindle version and the print version, two separate sites. So your best bet is just to go to Barnes and Noble, because they have their Nook version and the print version right there on one page.
Nice.
You just go to Barnes and Noble, type in Brenda Wilbee or Taming the Dragons, and that's going to pop up for you. You can always reach me at my website, brendawilbee.com. It's just my name, brendawilbee.com. And there you can see what I do in addition to writing, all of my writing. And if you want to specifically go to my book, there's a link there for Barnes & Noble.
Sure. Hey, well, thank you so much for being on the show. Powerful discussion today. And I hope that women and hopefully some men as well find some real encouragement and inspiration in our discussion today and what you had to say. So thanks again.
Well,
and
yeah, thank you for having me. This has been great.
I hope we have a chance to catch up again and do some further follow-up on any new writings or ideas, things that you're working on. Okay. All right. We'll see you later.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Right. Bye-bye.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the show today. If you enjoyed the show, drop me a line at the following address. In the meantime, stay tuned for other series on the Artist Edge. Take care.